my title is about evangelism. I'm going to be talking about personal evangelism. But even saying that, here's what I know, having been in ministry for a long time, is that whenever you say evangelism, people usually inwardly cringe when they hear that. Evangelism. And I think it's because we get a lot of bad models of what evangelism is supposed to look like. In other words, we're taught ways to do evangelism that tend to be counterproductive and maybe even turn people off. I'll give you an example of that. By the way, as a pastor, a former pastor, sermons today are usually a way for me to air all of my dirty laundry and all the terrible things that I ever did that I regret. And by the way, this is not what I mean by evangelism. Somebody standing up on a pulpit like Billy Sunday and being a spectacle, that is not what we're talking about. But when I say evangelist, I bet that's what you think. Or at the very least that you're going to do something that's weird and awkward and unnatural and it's going to turn people off. When I was a young pastor, I really wanted my church to grow, and so I took the leadership team of that church through a course called Share Jesus Without Fear. Now, Share Jesus Without Fear is kind of a question and answer approach to evangelism. And so shared it with the guys and trained them in one meeting of how to do this. And then I put a goal before them. I said, okay, now before our next meeting, what I want you to do, fellas, is everybody make sure you've shared Jesus without fear to at least one person. And so everybody got it. And it just so happened, it happened to be my lucky day, because in the service that week, a guy showed up named David. And David was a former buddy of mine in high school. I had not seen him since I graduated high school. And he showed up, and I thought, all right, there's my guy. And so sure enough, I set things up, and I invited David to have lunch with me during the week. And we went to Lexington to a nice barbecue restaurant. And by the way, in this course, they had these things called Share Jesus Without Fear Bibles. It's a little thin Bible that you could put in your back pocket. And just the right time, you could bring that thing out and share Jesus without fear. So David and I had a nice lunch and, discussed pleasantries. And then when lunch ended, suddenly I went into my Share Jesus Without Fear mode. And I had a perfectly natural conversation with him. And I started saying stuff like, so tell me, David, do you have any spiritual beliefs? That's not awkward at all. And things like, David, tell me, if you stood before God right now and he asked you, why should I let you into my kingdom, what would you say, David? And you go through this series of questions, and when they can't answer you properly, then you say, well, David, if you were wrong, would you want to know? Now, how can they answer no to that? I mean, it's a complete setup kind of program. I appreciate the logic behind it. But of course, he said, well, yeah, I'd want to know. And so I took out my Share Jesus Without Fear Bible, and I started going through the book of Romans, because that's where we always go when we're doing evangelism, because it's the Romans road, you may know. And so what I would do is go to these passages, and I would read one to David and say, now tell me what that means to you. And he would interpret it, and he was getting it right. And finally, we got to that passage in the Revelation. It's about to end when you get to the Revelation. It's Revelation chapter 3, where Jesus is saying to the church at Laodicea, I'm knocking at the door. If you'll open the door, I'll come in. And I said, David, and I read it. I said, David, what does that mean? And he said, you got to open the door, Jesus. I said, that's right, David. Do you want to open the door to your heart to Jesus right now? And he looked at me, and with all sincerity, he said, nope, I don't believe I do. And I thought to myself, that's not the way it's supposed to work. He is supposed to say yes to this, and we're supposed to have a spiritual moment right here in this restaurant. But he said no. And it got really more awkward at that point. Our conversation went nowhere else. He told me thank you. That was pretty much the end of our conversation. And guess what? He never came back to the church. And I did not see or hear from David for 20 years. Now, I don't think that necessarily means that I turned him off so much that he left church for 20 years. But obviously, he didn't want to be my project. That's what I took away from that meeting. David did not want to be my project. What he wanted was for me to respect him. I think he might have even wanted me to be his friend. Instead, he was a notch in my holster, so to speak. He was going to be my project and make me look good in front of the guys, and it didn't quite work out. That is not the approach that I want you to use. Now, for some people, that might work, and I think some people are gifted evangelists. I mean, I had one buddy who could He could talk about Jesus and people would come to faith left and right. And I think because he had the gift of evangelism. But I think that most of us, that's not where we need to be. That's not the kind of approach that we need to use. Instead, I think that God wants us to be what I call everyday evangelists. There's a natural approach that he has in mind. And if you'll start using this, I think you'll be more effective. And I think when you hear the word evangelist, you won't immediately cringe when you hear it. Here's what I want to offer you this morning. I want to show you an approach that is natural to you and might even be fun. You might even enjoy it. I think you will if you'll apply some of the things that we'll talk about this morning. And I think this is God's way. You are important to this community. This community needs you to share your faith. And I'm going to show you how to do it without really trying. You don't have to give it more time or money or, there's no slick program. Just a few simple changes, which is what we're going to look at. We're going to take this from the book of Colossians, chapter 4, verses 2 through 6. I'm going to keep circling back to this. Okay, so this will be the main slide that you see this morning. And let me set it up like this first. So we don't go into all the background, but I need to tell you a few things about Colossians. If you ever read Paul's letters in the New Testament, they follow the same basic pattern. First, he tells you who God is. Then he tells you how God has saved you, and then he tells you who you are in light of who God is and how he saved you. And he gives the action points. In Colossians, he's already done both of those things. And now what we get in chapter 4 are some concluding remarks. He's kind of wrapping it up. What I want you to see, though, is that he tells us how to be everyday evangelists in a very offhanded way. He doesn't really browbeat the people at Colossae. He doesn't give them some kind of real tight method. It's just kind of casual, for lack of a better word. And so look what he says to them. Now, let me set it up this way. He first of all tells them to pray for his big-time evangelistic efforts. I mean, he had the gift of evangelism. So he asks for that, and then he instructs them subtly how to be everyday evangelists. Verse 2 of chapter 4 in Colossians. Continue steadfastly in prayer, being watchful in it with thanksgiving. At the same time, pray also for us, that God may open to us a door for the word, to declare the mystery of Christ, on account of which I am in prison, that I may make it clear which is how I ought to speak. Walk in wisdom toward outsiders. By the way, outsiders are non-believers. That's who. So here is our approach to them. Walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. And there it is. I mean, really, what's that? A couple of verses. 2 verses really with instructions for us. And out of that, I'm going to show you how to be an everyday evangelist. And so let me begin this way. By the way, I'm a Baptist preacher, so we always have 3 points, and so here's my first one. To be an everyday evangelist and to share your faith without really trying, the first thing that you need to do, and by the way, these are not going to come up on here at all. The first thing that you need to do is to put God in his place. When it comes to the salvation of souls, you got to put God in his place. And I'll be very, very blunt about this. You can't save anybody. I know sometimes in Baptist circles we speak about it in that way, but you can't save anybody. You can't bring a single person into the kingdom of God. You can't personally do it. Your greatest acts of love, your best arguments, your clearest presentation of the gospel, none of that will bring a single person 1 foot closer to the kingdom of heaven. Only God can do it. God has to do it. You must have his power, or it's just not going to happen. And so you got to put God in his place. And here's why I think Paul starts this way. If you'll put God in his place, it'll put you in your place. And your place is being dependent on his power. It will also take a whole lot of pressure off of you. If you know, like with my friend David, did I drop the ball? Well, it seemed so. But who's in charge of David's salvation? It's ultimately God. So I may have failed in my approach, but David hasn't been failed completely because God is still in control. And so if you'll think about it that way, it takes a tremendous amount of pressure off of you, the person who's the evangelist. That it's not all up to you. It's up to God. And here's why that matters. If you think it's all up to you, you're going to be extremely nervous when you are trying to share your faith. And that's going to make it awkward. Imagine if I was standing up here talking to you today, and you could tell that I was nervous. You know, if I kept adjusting things and I kept stammering around. I'm not nervous because I taught high school for almost 14 years, and you can't throw anything at me that hasn't been thrown at me already. Yeah, sometimes literally. So, but if I was nervous, it would make you nervous. But because I'm at ease, it puts you at ease. I think that's one of Pastor Dana's qualities, is that he puts you at ease when he speaks. And so you have a good time when you come to church. And so if you know that God is in control, it'll put you at ease. Look at what Paul said here. And let's go to verse 3 in Colossians chapter 4. He said this, "At the same time, pray also for us." Why? "That God may open a door to us for the word to declare the mystery of Christ." Who is Paul depending on to open the door to share the gospel? He's depending on God to do that. God must do this, or our efforts are going to fail. Now, just in case that doesn't convince you, let me show you another place. Let's go to John chapter 6. John's Gospel chapter 6. And I'm not going to be all over the place in the Bible, but here's one that I want you to see. In John chapter 6, what's happening is that Jesus fed the multitudes, and suddenly he had this huge crowd following him. They even wanted to make him king. And so Jesus started saying really bizarre things like, "Oh, you want to follow me? Well, you've got to eat my flesh and drink my blood." And people were going, "What is he talking about? He's a lunatic. We thought he was king, but now we think he's insane." And what he's doing in chapter 6 of John's Gospel is explaining why people don't believe him. They said they did at first, but now they don't. And look at verse 44 of chapter 6. He said this, "No one can come to me unless the Father who has sent me draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day." How do people come to Jesus? The Father draws them. If the Father doesn't draw them, they're not going to come to Jesus. And let's look at another one, 65, verse 65 in the same chapter. "This is why I told you that no one can come to me unless it is granted him by the Father." Now, I'm not making that up. If God doesn't do it, they're not going to be saved. So God is the one who's in charge of salvation, not you, not me. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying we have no responsibility. We do have a responsibility. When God gives us the opportunity, we need to be faithful and take it. But he's the one who's in control of this thing. And here's how he really brought this home to me. Not too long after my fumbling of the ball with David, I was sitting in the church office, and it was late afternoon, and the phone rang. And these were before the days of caller ID, and so I answered it. And there was a guy who I didn't recognize. He had a very pronounced Southern accent, sounded like an older gentleman. And he was asking me about the church, and I told him. And then he said, "You know, there's one thing I've just never understood. I've never understood how a person is saved." I thought, "Oh, that's interesting." I said, "Yeah, well, it's pretty easy. Would you like me to explain it to you?" He said, "Yeah, if you don't mind, if you'd please explain it to me." I said, "Okay." And so I basically took him through the gospel. I said, well, God created us to be in an eternal relationship with himself, but all humans have sinned, and we fall short of God's perfect standard, and because of that, he's not going to allow us into his presence. And what we deserve, because of our sin, because of our rebellion against him, is to be outside of his presence for all eternity. But he's a God of love. And because he's a God of love, he made a way for us to be forgiven of our sins and to live with him forever. And that way is Jesus Christ. The Son of God put on human flesh, lived a perfectly sinless life. Then he died on a cross as a sacrifice for us. And when we trust that Jesus died for us, what God does is take our sin and place it on Jesus' account. All the good things that he ever did are placed on our account, and he views us as righteous. He views us as good with himself. And then one day he's going to make us righteous. And when we believe that he raised Christ from the dead, the Bible tells us that we're going to be raised from the dead too. And so I explained to him in very, very simple terms what salvation is about. And I said, "Do you understand that?" And he said, "Yeah, that makes perfect sense." I said, "Well, would you like to pray and receive Christ as your Lord and Savior?" He said, "Yeah, I think I would." And so we prayed, and I still had the David encounter in the back of my mind. We prayed, and there was a little bit of pause. And he said, and I'm gonna say it verbatim. He said, a peace just come over me like I ain't never felt before. And then he talked on about it a little bit more, and that was the end of our conversation. And my main thought after that was this real? Did this actually happen, that I had to do nothing except be faithful with who God gave me in the moment? And yeah, that was exactly what happened. Because God is over salvation, not us. We simply need to be faithful with the people and the moments that he's giving us. So put God in his place. It'll take a whole lot of pressure off of you. The second thing that we need to do, well, before I tell you my second point, let me say this. So it should take pressure off of you, and it shouldn't be an awkward conversation if you put God in his place. He's Lord of salvation. But here's the thing. I know that sometimes we get scared when it comes to sharing our Christian convictions. After all, God is invisible, and we're not. I mean, we're right there with them. What if they ask a question and I don't know how to answer it? What if they get angry or get upset? What am I going to do? And sometimes we become afraid of that happening, and so we get tight-lipped and we don't say anything. Well, with this next point, what I want to do is give you a way to enter into any conversation with any person and to completely take that fear away from you. You're not going to believe me when I say that at first, but when I show you this, you're going to go, wow, it's too easy. So here's what I want you to start doing. So the first thing is to put God in his place. The second, and some of you are going to breathe a sigh of relief when I tell you this. I want you to focus on cultivation rather than harvest. Focus on cultivation rather than harvest. Those of you who are farmers or you at least have a garden, what takes more time, cultivation or harvest? It's cultivation, no question about it. And I think that's the way it's supposed to be for most of us in our Christian lives. We're supposed to be cultivating relationships, whereas sometimes we in Baptist churches set you up for the harvest. We want you to pray the prayer immediately, whereas a lot of people really need a little bit more cultivation. Like with my buddy David, what happened was the fruit wasn't ripe yet. I think he's a Christian today. I think he is. But at that point, 20-some years ago, he was not ready. Focus on cultivation rather than harvest. The harvest might come, but not quickly. And so focus on that. Here's what I want you to do. Let me put it in a different way. Stop focusing on winning the argument or winning the person to Christ, and instead just win the person. Just do that. Just develop a relationship with them and focus on cultivation rather than harvest. Look at how Paul puts this. Go back to Colossians 4 with me. Verse 5. He tells them how to speak. And what he's really telling us is to engage people who aren't believers in ordinary, everyday conversations. But you need to be careful how you do it. And here's what he said in verse 5. Walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt. And I'm going to stop it right there. There should be a characteristic of our conversations that would make us win some people. And here are some of the things that he's saying. First, he said to walk in wisdom with outsiders. When you have a conversation with a person who's not a believer and you don't know where they are spiritually, is it really wise to take out your Share Jesus Without Fear Bible and slap them with it immediately? I don't think that's wise. Now, in some cases, that might work. Neither is it wise to go to the other extreme and say nothing about what you think or what you believe. Instead, there needs to be a middle way here where we have conversations with people and we very subtly, very gently, very respectfully move the conversation to God. And there are ways to do that that are they won't even see it coming. And it's completely natural. So he said, be wise, walk in wisdom. And he said, let your speech always be gracious. What does grace mean? Grace is a gift. Gracious speech is giving speech rather than taking speech. And then he said it should be seasoned with salt. What does salt do? Salt makes things that are otherwise not so tasty pleasant, like broccoli. Broccoli's really good for you, but it tastes terrible. Unless you can douse it with a bunch of cheese, which I can't do anymore, I can at least put some salt on it. It gives it more flavor. It makes it taste a lot better. It makes it pleasant. And so that should be the characteristic of our speech. What else? I know you know this. What else does salt do? Makes you thirsty. And I think that should be the character of our speech as well. By the way, I love it. Y'all actually respond. Do you know how many Baptist churches nobody will say anything? This is great. Salt makes you thirsty. And so our speech with people should make them think. It should leave a good, lasting impression. And there's a way to do that. And so let me flesh this out just a little bit. Let's talk about the gracious part of it. I think that having gracious speech simply means this. Stop being so self-absorbed in your conversations with people. How do you feel with people? And you might be one. If you go, well, I can't think of anybody who's like that. It might be you. How do you feel about people who always talk about themselves no matter what the conversation? Or if you're, some of you know, or if you're talking about something important to you, you got those people who will always find a way to turn it around to themselves. And somehow, I mean, they're geniuses at this. Do you enjoy those conversations? No, you don't. You can't stand that. What we enjoy most is people asking us about ourselves and our opinions. And so what I want you to do is start taking an interest in other people. Be aware of the way that you speak to others. If you can be interested in them, guess what? They'll be interested in you. And I know that sounds simplistic, but let me share with you how this works. I used to go to the YMCA in Thomasville. I live in Thomasville, but Planet Fitness is a lot cheaper, so I go there now. But there was a desk worker at the YMCA in Thomasville named Linda. Very wonderful woman, greets everybody who comes in, very pleasant woman. I knew nothing about Linda except that she was friends with my daughter who's 24 now. My daughter's a runner. Linda is a runner. And so every time I would come in, Linda would ask me about my daughter, Anna Gray. And, she'd greet me, say something about Anna Gray, and I'd be on my way. And then I started to feel guilty about this. I thought, every time I talk with this woman, it's always about what I'm interested in. I need to try to have a conversation with her. She might not be a follower of Christ. I need to be interested in her. And so one day I went in after my greeting from Linda. I was upstairs in the fitness room, running from death on the treadmill, as I often do. And I was thinking, how can I have a conversation with her? And then I remembered Anna Gray, my daughter, told me that Linda had been on the Appalachian Trail, that she had walked hundreds of miles, many of them by herself, on the Appalachian Trail. So I finished with my exercise, went downstairs, went out, and she was telling me goodbye. I said, my daughter tells me you're an Appalachian Trail person. That's all I said. Her face lit up, and she started telling me all about it. She started telling me about the time when she was by herself. It was chilly that night, I would say cold that night, and somehow she got separated from her campsite in the woods. And all she had with her was a trash bag. It got below freezing. She had a trash bag, was the only thing. God miraculously kept her alive through the night, and then the next day she miraculously found her campsite and survived. I found out from that conversation that she is a committed and outspoken Christian. And it was a wonderful conversation. I learned a lot about her. And now, if I ever see her again, but I'm a cheapskate, so maybe I won't. If I ever see her again, I've got somewhere to pick up and begin with her because I know what she's interested in. All I'm advocating is that you meet people where they are. Talk about things that they're interested in. That's gracious speech. It's giving speech. It also should be speech that is salty. And don't take that the wrong way. Not salty where you're cursing in your speech. Salt, it's flavorful, like I've already said. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to not only go into areas that people are interested in, I want you also to wade into areas that you might have been uncomfortable with before. Areas perhaps of controversy where you can have a spiritual conversation with somebody. What I want to share with you now is something that I consider gold, and it's a way to be in the driver's seat of any conversation. You can get into any discussion and share your Christian convictions without really even knowing anything about the subject. I'm making that promise to you right now. And it's going to come down to two questions. If you will get into conversations about subjects that may even be controversial and just start asking these two questions, you can drive the conversation toward God and maybe toward faith in Christ. And here's what these are called. Some of you are my age or older, so you're going to know this. Back in the 70s and in the early 80s, there was a TV show on called Columbo. Some of you know Columbo, Peter Falk. Very good. Peter Falk in Columbo, there was one premise to the show. Somebody had been murdered, and he always knew who it was, but he was trying to flush them out. All right? That's what the show's about. And the way he would do it is by asking questions. And you knew he was about to get them when he was about to leave the room, and he would say, I just have one more question. Good. This is an audience who knows Columbo. And he would ask that one question, and that one question would catch them every single time. These are called Columbo Questions. It's 2 questions. They were developed by a guy named Greg Kokel, who wrote a book called Tactics. They're so simple, you're going to go, he wrote a book on this? Yes, he did. It's by asking these 2 questions, you can guide any conversation. And here they are. They're very simple. They require no knowledge on your part. None. Here's the first one. Get ready. This is worth the price of admission. Columbo question number 1, what do you mean by that? Columbo question number 2, what are your reasons for believing that? So I'll say those again. And you say them in different ways, but you ask, what do you mean by that? And second, what are your reasons for believing that? Or why do you think that's true? That's another way of saying it. Just by asking those 2 questions, you can get into any conversation and lead it toward God. Let me give you an example. All right, and I'm choosing the most controversial subject that I could at this moment. Let's say that you are in a conversation with somebody, you do not know them to be a follower of Christ at all, and they say something like, Black Lives Matter. Now, that is a hand grenade of a conversation. If you just toss that into a room, people immediately get nervous. But let's use our Columbo questions. Somebody says, what do you think about Black Lives Matter? Or what are your views on Black Lives Matter? Now, you could say, well, I think all lives matter. And that would be true, but you've just ended the conversation, and it's going to go nowhere, especially if they disagree with you and they've got an agenda. That's it. You're done. And so instead, let's ask our Columbo questions. The person says, what do you think about Black Lives Matter? Your response is, what do you mean by Black Lives Matter? Now, is that threatening or difficult? What do they mean by Black Lives Matter? They could mean one of 3 things. I don't know if you know this. They could be talking about the value of black people, the inherent worth of black people. They could be talking about something that our culture calls systemic racism, that black men in particular are brutalized by the police. That might be what they're talking about. Or when they say Black Lives Matter, they could be talking about the neo-Marxist organization called Black Lives Matter that wants to tear down Western civilization. How do you know what they mean unless you ask the question, what do you mean by Black Lives Matter? You don't. You're making assumptions, and you can kill the conversation just by giving your opinion. So hold off on your opinion. So that's Columbo question number 1. What do you mean by Black Lives Matter? You can go further. No matter what answer they give you, you can simply follow up with Columbo question number 2. Why do you think Black Lives Matter? Or what are your reasons for believing Black Lives Matter? If a person is a secularist, if they are an atheist, what's the best they can ever say to that question? I mean, they're not going to say, because God's holy word tells me so. What will they ever say? They'll say, we all just know, which you can follow up with, well, apparently not. Neo-Nazis and the average Klansman don't think Black Lives Matter. So I don't think we all do just know that. Please tell me where you're getting this from. And just keep asking who says, basically, which is Columbo question number 2. I mean, really, if a person is an atheist, if they're a secularist, how did we get here? We're just a big cosmic accident. All you are is stardust. All you are is molecules in motion. And the molecules of a black person are no more valuable than the molecules of that bench, if that's all we are. And in a secular worldview, that's the best you can do. And so that's the kind of question that you ask. What do you mean by that? And what are your reasons for believing that? If a person can't give you a good answer, they might totally rethink their worldview. And you don't have to even push it any further than that. Just ask those 2 questions and let them try to answer. And so that's how you focus on cultivation rather than harvest. And then you might get to the 3rd point, all right, which is this. Seize the opportunities that present themselves. Seize the opportunities that present themselves. If you engage in these types of discussions and your speech is wise and gracious and seasoned with salt, I don't know that I would call this a promise, but it's at least an implied promise that God's going to help you out. Let's go back to verses 5 and 6. just as a repeat, in Colossians 4. Again, Paul said, walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that, here's the conclusion, so that you may know how you ought to answer each person. It is implied that you will know how to answer each person if you'll do the other things. So let's go back to our Black Lives Matter question. If you're talking with somebody, by the way, if a person gets angry or upset when you're asking these questions, just back off. You don't have to pursue it any further. Just let it go. I promise you, if they don't have a good answer, it's going to be what the author of Tactics calls a stone in the shoe. You ever get a little stone in your shoe when you're out for a walk? If you're like me, I try to walk it out at first. I think that if I'll just keep going, it'll go to the side and exit, but it never does. And eventually, what must you do if you're on a walk and there's a stone in your shoe? Yeah, you got to stop and take that thing out. If they can't answer your question, they're going to have to stop and deal with it. All right? They may come back to you and ask you why you think Black Lives Matter. As Christians, can't we agree that Black Lives Matter? If you say no, we're in deep trouble. Yes, and we've got good reasons for why we say Black Lives Matter, and secularists don't. What are our reasons? Well, God's Word says all people were created in His image. That gives every single person, no matter what their skin color, inherent worth and value before God. Let's see, why else do Black Lives Matter? How about this? Because Jesus Christ, God incarnate, came to save all people, including black people. So we got that good reason. And our Lord commanded us to love our neighbor as ourselves. I think we've got some pretty good reasons. A secularist cannot give you those reasons. And so that's how you seize that opportunity. And if you've been in this discussion, you'll have been thinking about it. And again, I think there's a promise here that it's going to come to you. Now, here's the beauty of this. Sometimes people arrive at the conclusion on their own. When I was teaching high school several years ago, as a youngish teacher, I was never really young because I went into it when I was 39. And for the first few years, every time I would teach, I thought it was my job to give my opinion to the students in front of me. But I discovered pretty quickly that teenagers do not like the opinions of old people. They just don't. Yeah, some of y'all understand that too. They don't. And so when I ran across this tactic stuff, I thought, wow, this is it. And I started using it. And one of the great moments came in a government class that I was teaching. We were talking about natural rights. Do people have natural rights? And I was trying to make the case in class that if you don't have God, you don't have natural rights. You don't have a foundation for it. And one student objected to this. His name was Alex. Alex was an international student. He was from Brazil. And so Alex said, well, that's ridiculous. And we talked about morality, that natural rights come from an idea of morality. He said, well, we don't need God to know morality or natural rights. I said, okay, Alex, let me ask you this. What do you mean by morality? Right? So that's Columbo question number 1. He said, well, it's right and wrong. I said, okay, I agree with that. How do we know right and wrong? He said, well, we just know. We don't need the Bible for that. I said, well, let me give you an example. What about equal rights for women? Should women have equal rights with men? And he said, of course we should. And so I asked Columbo question number 2, why? Please tell me why. And he said, we all just know. I said, no, we don't. Go to Saudi Arabia and you will see they do not believe that women should have equal rights with men. And I said, so why should we give women equal rights? By the way, I believe women should have equal rights. It's just the example I was using. He said, well, it's the loving thing to do. I said, well, who says it is? He said, we all just know. I said, well, no, we don't. Please tell me where you're getting this from. Why are we supposed to love people? Who says? Who says that's the right thing to do? And he kept giving me these lame answers, and I just kept saying, who says? How do you know? Who says? And he finally said, well, the Bible. And I went, thank you. I didn't say this, but I thought, thank you for doing my work for me. And he knew it. It just came to him, and that gave me the opportunity to say to him and to the class. So I seized the opportunity. That's correct. It's from the Bible. See, here's the situation. If there is no God, there is no foundation for morality. And if there's no foundation for morality, what we call equal rights or natural rights, we're just making them up. Here today, gone tomorrow. I mean, we might evolve to a day where only certain people have natural rights. But if there is a God who exists, then we have a foundation for morality. We know right and wrong because we can look to him and his character. And from that, we can derive human rights that are true for all people at all places and all times. In my class, it was one of those times I could tell the students in my class who agreed with me, I know they wanted to clap, but they didn't do it. And it was one of those moments where the so that worked. I knew how I ought to answer that guy just because of the way he was answering my questions. And so I want to encourage you, put God in his place. Focus on cultivation rather than harvest. Seize the opportunities that present themselves. You may even have a spiritual conversation. I've been praying for this one family member for years now. And last week, I was in a conversation with this older family member, and we're just sitting in front of the TV, and this person said, basically, and I'm sorry for the language I'm going to use, but please forgive me, he says, before he says the wrong thing. He basically said, life sucks and then you die. And then he followed up with, maybe the next life will be better. Do you know what I said to him? I said, what do you mean by maybe? What do you mean by maybe? Columbo question number 1. And we had for 5 minutes, for the first time in my relationship with this person, a spiritual conversation. He didn't come to Christ in that conversation, but the door was opened. And I think it was from this. It was from many, many years of prayer, combined with being wise in the conversation, and of course, with God's power. And that's what I want to leave you with this morning. So,